when we're talking with clients, they're oftentimes fascinated by ERP failures and they want to hear about the lessons from ERP failures. But oftentimes we don't spend enough time looking at how can we avoid failure and what are the things that we can do to mitigate risk in our ERP implementations. Today I'm going to talk about the things that are critical to ensure that you avoid ERP failure in your digital transformation initiatives. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting Group. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients through their digital transformation and ERP journeys. And I recently posted a top 10 video, which I've included a link to below. It's a top 10 video of the top ERP failures of all time. And much like a train wreck, people just love hearing about failure. I could put up a top 10 successes of all time, and I've tried doing something like that in the past, and no one seems to really care about the successes. They want to hear about the failures, what went wrong. They want to hear about the bloody, gory details. And so what we're going to talk about today is kind of a hybrid approach. We want to focus on your success, but we also want to talk about what are the things that cause companies to fail, what are the things you can do differently to avoid becoming one of the casualties on our top 10 ERP failures list of all time. Before we dive into the quality assurance tool, I wanted to share with you this implementation risk assessment. It's an online tool, it's free. I've included a link below, and I encourage you to take this assessment to see where your project stands in terms of overall risk and what some of the remediation recommendations we might have for where you are in your transformation. So check out the link below. It's a free tool that'll allow you to assess the risks of your transformation. So one thing we've learned in our experience as project recovery and expert witness and general implementation consultants is that ERP failures are not a coincidence. They don't just happen to organizations, and the reasons why organizations fail are not random. There aren't a bunch of different reasons why projects fail. It's usually for the same set of reasons, or at least a very similar pattern of reasons that cause projects to fail. And so what I wanted to talk about today is what are the big takeaways from failures in all the expert witness work we've done, all the implementation work we've done, the project recoveries that we've saved. What are the things we've learned and the 5 things I can leave you with as you're about to embark on a digital transformation or ERP implementation? Now, the biggest thing that companies do wrong in their implementations when they fail is that they don't adequately manage risk. They don't identify the risk, they don't foresee the risk, and they don't expect those risks to happen, or the risks are there and they don't see them, or the risks are there and they don't realize that they're going to be damaging and cause disruption to the organizations. So that's the reason why most projects fail, is because number one, they don't identify risk. So that's the number one underlying theme that we see with ERP failures. So before I get to the list of the 5 things to avoid ERP failure, another thing to think about is what exactly is ERP failure? And what does ERP failure mean to you? What would it mean to you? So for a lot of organizations, it means that we don't want to disrupt the organization. If we have a situation where we can't ship product or we can't close the books, that is going to be a failure for us. In other cases, it could be that we run over budget, or we take too long to implement, or the employees are confused and operations are chaotic. Whatever the case may be, we need to define what is failure and how can we avoid those risks. A majority of organizations that we've surveyed and worked with found that they went over budget and took too much time to implement their ERP systems, and about 50% of organizations had trouble at the time of go live with operational risk and material operational risk. That is, they couldn't ship product, they couldn't close the books, etc. So we need to define what is risk to us, what is failure, and how can we mitigate those failures will be the topic that we'll get to here now. So the first thing we need to think about as we go through our ERP implementation is to, first of all, and this may sound a little bit counterintuitive, but stop focusing on avoiding failure. And I know that is exactly the opposite of what I'm suggesting in the title of this video, but I'll explain what I mean by that. When you look at sports and organizations that are winning teams, they typically win by having a good defense and a good offense. It's pretty rare that you have a situation where a sporting team wins solely by having a great defense, but they can't score. So it's a very similar thing with ERP implementations. If we're just focused on not screwing up and not failing, we're still going to fail because we're not focused on the things that are going to make us successful. So that's the first thing, is to stop the mindset of only focusing on mitigating risk, only focusing on avoiding failure, and only focusing on setting the bar so low that we're going to fall well short of what the possibilities of this project are. So it's important to add offense to that defensive mix, and I'll talk here in a second about the different ways that we can add offense to the mix. The second thing is organizational change management. That is the number one thing that we see in ERP failures. If I had to pick one thing that I see the most commonly, it's that organizational change management has not been focused on. It's something that the organization didn't understand or fell well short on executing. So organizational change management is the number one thing you can do to ensure that your project is successful. Now, within organizational change, that means a lot of different things. There's a lot of layers within change management. You have executive alignment, making sure that the executives are aligned on what the vision for the project is and what the goals and objectives of the project are. That's one of those high-level strategic change management types of things. There's also the change impacts, understanding what the impacts to the organization are, how people are going to need to change, how their jobs are going to change, how the roles need to be redefined, how we're going to train them, how we're going to communicate to them. So the change impacts are very important. That's a core fundamental part of change management. And then another part of it is just executing a comprehensive change management plan. And too often companies think of change management as just training. So we want a comprehensive OCM plan that isn't just training. It's communications, it's change impact, it's stakeholder assessment, stakeholder analysis and alignment. It's everything that is related to change management. And I've included a link below to a video that talks more about change management in more detail. So I encourage you to check that out. That unpacks the whole concept of change management in a lot more detail. But these are a few of the low-hanging fruits or the higher priority areas within organizational change management. So make sure you have a solid change management plan. I have yet to meet an executive who said that they invested too much or even enough in their organizational change management efforts. Even for the more successful projects we've been involved with, there's still an underlying feeling that they could have done more to make the project more successful from a change management perspective. So chances are very, very high that change management is going to be a lot harder than you think, and whatever number or amount of effort that you're thinking for your change management initiative is probably not enough. So be thinking about how can we do more to focus on this number one critical success factor for avoiding ERP failure. The third thing that we find with ERP failures, and I'm going to translate this into what you should be doing, the thing that we find with failures is that they're technology-driven initiatives. We're going in with a technology-first mentality. For example, S/4HANA or Oracle ERP Cloud, that's our platform of choice. We're going to lead with that technology and let that drive what our transformation means to us. The most effective organizations and the most successful ones are the ones that lead with technology, so they're business-driven initiative. And on the flip side, when we look at failures, we find a much higher rate of technology-driven initiatives than we do business-driven. In fact, I can't recall a recent failure that we've helped recover or that I've testified as an expert witness on where the organization took a technology-driven perspective and somehow didn't fail. So that's something that we need to keep in mind, is that this business-driven approach is extremely important to let our operations and our organization and what we want to be when we grow up, that should drive and dictate what our technology initiative is to us. And that's going to make things a lot more clear to the organization. It's going to create a lot less headache later on. And it's also important to note that this type of approach requires more preparation up front. So in theory or on paper, it may seem like we're slowing down by spending more time getting alignment on what we want this project to be, what we want our organization and our operations to look like going forward so that we can define the blueprint for the transformation. But that will save a lot of time later on that far exceeds the amount of time we had to spend doing that up front. And not only that, it'll save even more money because now we can dictate the tempo of when we bring in outside consultants and system integrators so that we don't have a big army of consultants charging by the hour while we're trying to figure out what we want to be when we grow up, we've already defined that work and done that work up front prior to starting the technical implementation. So the business-driven aspect is critical to avoiding ERP failure. Number 4 on the list is to have a QA or quality assurance framework, and a very structured quality assurance framework. And I'm going to show you a graphic here in a second that unpacks this a little bit more. But in general, the most difficult implementations, the ones that fail, are ones that did not have a good quality assurance framework. They weren't good at mitigating risks or even identifying risks. Or worse yet, it was a system integrator who had an incentive not to identify the risk because it was pointing the finger at themselves in many cases. So they hid those risks or didn't convey those risks to the client. So having an independent and agnostic view of where the risks are and how we can ensure quality throughout the entire implementation is critical. So when we talk about QA framework, I wanted to give you an example here. I've included a screenshot of it here that talks a bit about what we mean by quality assurance. What are some of the things that we should be looking at or that a quality assurance framework should be considering? So you'll see a number of things here that range from the procurement process up front, the first box you see, which is, are we complying to our contracts? Do we have the right amount of software? Are we negotiating the right rates for software licenses and related services? So the whole procurement and compliance with procurement is very important. Also, project planning. Do we have a solid project plan and a risk mitigation plan early, even before we start the technical implementation? We should have those risks identified because, guess what? I hate to break the news to you, but no matter who you are or where you are in your process right now, there are risks underlying your implementation right now, even if you haven't started. So we need to identify what those risks are and be aware of them and have them front and center so that we can help mitigate them. Project governance and controls, making sure that we've got the right project plan in place, we've got the right controls, the right decision-making process. How are executive steering committee members going to be involved in the process? What decisions do we expect of them? We need to have this stuff all defined so that we operate like a well-oiled machine during the implementation, and our project team can be the most effective and efficient that it can be. We also look at project resources. Do we have the best resources and adequate resources internally and externally from our system integrator? Just as importantly, do we have non-system integrator types of resources? Perhaps there's independent solo consultants or independent consulting firms like Third Stage that can help augment what the system integrator does. And the other thing that we're seeing more and more of is not relying on any one party for providing your external resources, but potentially relying on multiple system integrators or multiple parties for those resources. And then the other part of the project resource component is making sure that you don't have too many resources on the project, particularly when you're relying on those outside resources. What we see often is that companies get lured into having too many people on the project when you could get by with a lot less. So the meter runs at a higher rate, the consulting companies are making more money, but you are spending more money than you should. So we need to rationalize and validate who's on the project and when, and make sure you're not over-investing in the time of these outside consulting firms. So the next thing we need to be thinking about is process alignment. So looking at ensuring that we've defined our future state processes and that the technology is aligned with those processes, and in cases where we're changing our processes to fit the software, that we've changed those processes. Simply because we've designed the software to meet a certain process or workflow doesn't mean that it is reality. So we need to make sure we actually implement those process changes and those organizational changes that go along with it. The other part of that process component is the requirements traceability. So making sure that all those requirements we defined early in the evaluation and in the planning process that we said we wanted to get out of this transformation, making sure that we go back to that and confirm and validate that the vendors and the system integrators and the consultants are all delivering on what we expected to get out of the transformation. Another component is configuration and development. So looking at, have we configured and developed the software in a way that makes sense for the organization and that meets the needs of our business processes. Similarly with architecture, chances are you're not relying only on one ERP system and that's it. Chances are that ERP system or systems are going to need to integrate with other third-party systems, whether it be third-party bolt-ons or legacy systems that you are choosing to remain intact, Or in some cases, like if you're in the pharmaceutical industry, you may have some regulatory systems that have to be in place, like a LIMS system or whatever the case may be. So making sure that you have a clear architecture and a clear integration plan for the entire solution is really important. And again, that goes outside the realm of your system integrator or consultants that are focused on one technology. And the other component is change management. And I could spend the entire video talking just about change management. In fact, I have done that on several occasions, and I've included links to the change management videos below, or at least some of the change management videos below. But making sure that we have a solid change management plan and that we identify those pockets of resistance within the organization early on so that we can mitigate them and get ahead of them before they become real problems. That change management component is something we have to really focus on ensuring that we mitigate throughout the implementation. There's also master data management. This is something that's often an afterthought, something that we do right at the end of the project, right before we do our final test or our final round of conference room pilots. And that's a big disaster waiting to happen if you're planning to do that. You want to bring forward the data activities as much as you can because that's probably on your critical path and is probably going to determine how long this transformation is going to take. In fact, if I had to pick two things that are going to delay your project, it's either going to be master data management or even more likely organizational change management. Those two things are the most likely to delay your project and increase your costs. So the sooner we can start those two things and do those two things really well, the better off we're going to be. Testing. We're not just talking about technology testing and software testing, but user acceptance testing, working through different scenarios, working through your business processes, and ensuring that the frontline people within your organization have signed off on how the technology works, which not only helps us make sure we have a solid solution we're rolling out to the organization, but it also helps from a change management perspective because now we've started to train people and educate, get them involved in the process and understanding how this whole thing is going to look once we go live. So that testing process is extremely important, particularly as it relates to user acceptance testing. A general rule of thumb is you should have at least 3 rounds of user acceptance testing. Oftentimes system integrators will try to get by with 1 or 2, but you definitely need at least 3. We found that to be the most important or the minimum that you'd want to see. The next is security. This is another afterthought in many cases where we've delivered a solution, but we haven't set up security profiles right. The day we go live, people are locked out of certain functions and things they need to do because we haven't set up the security profiles right. So when we're defining our business processes in the future state, we want to also be defining what our security roles and maps look like. This is also an opportunity for us to make sure that we're compliant. If we're a publicly traded company, this is our opportunity to ensure that we have Sarbanes-Oxley compliance. If we're a US-based public company, we need to be SOX compliant. So security profiles are a big part of that, ensuring that we've locked down the processes and the functions that need to happen with certain individuals. And then reporting and analytics, really understanding what it is you're going to get out of the system, what you want to get out of the system, and making sure you have access to real-time information is important. That should be part of your testing process. It should also be part of your requirements definition in terms of defining what those reporting and analytics need to be. And then finally, there's benefits realization and performance. So ensuring that we actually get the benefits that we expected out of the system. And this is probably the most important part of that offense strategy that I talked about before. A lot of this is defense because we're looking for flaws and defects, but the solutions we go after are meant to be offensive. So once we've identified a risk that we haven't pursued or a risk that we haven't addressed, that gives us an offensive strategy to get ahead of it and start to remediate and start to improve. And when we get to benefits realization, this is an area where we're focusing on how can we get more value out of this implementation and not just set the bar down here, which is let's not fail, but let's also make sure that we get as much as we can out of this investment because we're going to spend a lot of time and money on this implementation. Hopefully it's the last time we do it for the next 15, 20 years, so let's get it right. The way to do that is through benefits realization. So that QA framework that I just went over is the 4th thing that you can do to ensure that you avoid failure and you're setting yourself up for success. Now the last thing, the 5th thing that you can do to avoid failure, and this is a really important but simple one, is remember that you're in charge of this project. And for those of you that don't know what I mean, or you may be struggling or uncertain why I'm saying this, Too often we defer our project or try to outsource our project to other parties. We defer to our system integrator who has sold us a vision for what this project should look like, and we let them as experts handle this, and we let them make decisions around what our operations are going to look like. We lean on them for best practices, which don't exist, by the way, but we lean on them for best practices to tell us how to run our business. That is a recipe for a disaster waiting to happen. We need to take ownership of the project and recognize that if this project fails, it's not your system integrator's fault, it's not your third-party consultant's fault, it's not your vendor's fault, it's your fault. And so on the flip side of that, if we succeed, it's not going to be because your system integrator was awesome or your independent consultant was awesome or the vendor was awesome. It's going to be because you managed the project well and you did so in a way that ensured that you not only avoided failure, but that you ensured success. So recognize that you're in charge. Take everything with a grain of salt. You're going to get a lot of advice with a lot of marketing spin, a lot of overly optimistic views of what these projects could look like, but really take a hard look at you as an organization, what makes the most sense for you as an organization. Set aside the best practices and the Kool-Aid and all the marketing spin that you're going to get, and really look and reflect on what is it we want as an organization and how is it we're going to make this project more successful. So you're in charge, and that might be the biggest takeaway that I'd say from these top 5. So I hope you found this information useful. Avoiding failure is really important. It's very doable, and if you do these 5 things that I've mentioned here today, you're going to set yourself on a path to a greater likelihood of success. And I encourage you to download some of the content I've included in the links below. There's some great materials and resources that I've included for you to augment this video. I hope you found this helpful, and if you would, please like the video, subscribe to my channel, and share any comments you might have in the comments field below. I'd love to hear what feedback you have, what you've seen work, or what you're experiencing now in your transformations, and I look forward to chatting with you soon. Take care and have a great day.